hate these potatoes. There's a dead fly in my potato.
A few years ago, as a film lover and a parent, I decided to introduce my son to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was going to screen at the BFI South Bank, and it was going to screen on 35mm, because the consensus at that point was that to watch a great film you needed to watch it on 35mm. To watch it digitally was somehow second rate. But the reality was that the 35mm print was horrible. It was scratched and bubbly, and halfway through the film it gave up on us completely, cracking and disintegrating on screen. And it made me wonder what the real essence of cinema and cinematic storytelling was that I was trying to pass on to my son. Was it about the ritual of the projection, or was it about the movie? Because the ritual of a 35mm film can be gorgeous, the same way that a ritual of a digital film can be beautiful too. But either way, what's important is surely the movie. So in the past, if you wanted to be a filmmaker, you were immediately going to be facing some really quite high economic barriers to do with the cost of the equipment and the kind of training you were going to have. And digital film came along and instantly exploded a lot of those barriers, and it suddenly opened up the film landscape to all kinds of voices that had previously been excluded. Digital democratized film. And in 25 years since digital started doing that, you've seen working class filmmakers, filmmakers of colour, women filmmakers, come through and make their films and tell their stories in a way that I think would have just been flatly unachievable, in the pre-digital era. Among the landmarks of that early digital moment, I would probably point people a film called Tarnation, which was directed by Jonathan Cowart. And Jonathan Cowart, who we see there on screen, had in the 80s and 90s shot a whole series of home movies documenting his troubled, poor childhood in underclass America. And then digital technology allowed him to weave together those fragmentary moments and memories and images into just an astonishing digital documentary feature. He mosaicked the film together on an Apple iMac computer for a couple of $100. And Tarnation was mind-blowing. And it was only possible technically and economically because of the digital revolution. And once it had been made possible by digital, culture then said, well, actually, this kind of raw, intimate, revelatory filmmaking, this is the kind of story that we now demand. Of course, there was upheaval, at the time of the digital revolution, as there always is at the time of any revolution. Jobs were lost and some skills were lost, and people had to retrain and learn new skills. But 25 years later, after that digital explosion, I think the film industry, as an employer, is actually bigger than it ever was in the pre-digital era. Economically, the barriers to filmmaking have come down, more films are being made, more people are being employed making them. For all the evils of social media as an offshoot of the explosion of digital culture, I think the fact that so many people everywhere are getting so used to putting their ideas on a screen has to be a good thing for cinema in the long term. People talk about TikTok and social media killing cinema, but I think all that's happening really is a readjustment of the hierarchy. When I fell in love with movies, they were the preeminent popular art form, and now there's so much more competition for eyeballs. But I think any great art form has to learn from its rivals and to compete for attention. But you want a filmmaker to be able to use any tool that they choose to make their film, whether that's digital film or 35mm. I think you just have to remember that using 35mm is a privilege, because of the economic barriers that are attached to it. And then it's really important not to elevate shooting on 35mm into being seen as somehow real filmmaking. In the same way that projecting a film on 35mm was sometimes talked about as being the only real way to watch a piece of great cinema. I think if you do that, you risk rebuilding and re-erecting those dreadful barriers, of privilege that digital film did such a glorious job of demolishing and destroying a quarter of a century ago. Cinema is technology. Cinema is innovation. and cinema is revolution. So if you ask yourself the question, would a revolutionary and an innovator of cinema like Stanley Kubrick have used digital technology? The answer is, of course. In 2022, Stanley Kubrick would absolutely be using digital film. He would also probably be using 35mm still as well, because what Kubrick understood was that digital film, 35mm film, these are both just tools. They are tools in making something more important than either, which is cinema. And now, can I please just watch the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind?